Hello, everybody. Um, it's Jordan here from Free China Post, doing Free China Pod number 4. I would prefer to do this with my partner Ari, but as we discussed in the last podcast, he is currently on vacation out of the country, and his internet access is somewhat limited. So here we are. Unfortunately for you guys, it's just me. I really would prefer to have a guest on this one, but it's a little short notice. I felt like with the gravity of events that have just taken place recently, we had to come out and do a podcast here. Most of you probably already know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the recent approval of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We've done, if you want to hear a little bit more background about the things that he's accused of, the sexual assault allegations, you can go back and listen to the earlier podcast. Give you a brief rundown real quick. Basically, he was put forward as a candidate for the Supreme Court during the summer, and recently multiple women, starting with Dr. Blasey Ford, came forward saying that in high school, her account was in high school, that he sexually assaulted her. He attempted to rape her, and she narrowly escaped. Even the Republicans argue that her story is quite credible. However, they, for some reason, don't think it was Kavanaugh. I think if we're serious with ourselves, that's probably because that's their nominee, and they're kind of out of time to find another nominee. So after that, subsequently, 2 other women came forward, one arguing that he basically exposed himself when she was very drunk to her. That was in college when he was at Yale. And the third victim had a lot of allegations. She's represented by Michael Avenatti, who is the attorney for Stormy Daniels. I assume most of you know who Stormy Daniels is by this point. She had a lot of allegations, such as Kavanaugh and his longtime buddy Mike Judge were doing things such as drugging women so that they could have group sex with the women while they were passed out. I encourage people to go do more research about all of those allegations. But the main one was Blasey Ford. She was the only one that testified in front of the hearing for his confirmation. And as I said, she gave a very moving, very credible testimony. But the Republicans didn't really seem to care. I'll get into more details later, but there are other people that seem to basically just have voted essentially only for their political livelihood, as opposed to looking at the facts and looking at the evidence of both the sexual assault and how Kavanaugh and Blasey Ford carried themselves during the proceedings. To give examples, Kavanaugh was very combative during the proceedings. He was angry, he shouted, he cried, he kind of refused to answer a lot of questions. The prosecutor that the Republicans had got very close to a date in his calendar that he gave to the committee, and as she did that, she basically ran out of time for that questioning, and when they came back from a recess, I believe it was, the Republicans basically stonewalled and stopped letting her ask questions, even though they said that she would get to question both Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh. I think she got a little too close to the truth, and the slime balls that we have as a lot of senators, but especially for the Republican senators, didn't like that. They didn't want her to do a real investigation. They wanted a sham investigation, and a questioning similar to the one that Jeff Flake called for. And as we can see, the FBI investigation that we had didn't really bring anything to light. They basically didn't interview anyone of note. They didn't interview the two main people in the whole thing, that being Kavanaugh, obviously, and also Dr. Blasey Ford, like I said, who was the first victim to come forward, or alleged victim. They're basically alleged that the Trump administration hamstrung the FBI and told them who they could and couldn't investigate. And so subsequently they refused to interview a number of people that came forward and directly requested that they be interviewed, former classmates, roommates, almost none of which who were interviewed. So the scope and the length of the investigation was laughable. It was limited to a week, and they basically found nothing, and none of the information was released to the public. It was all, if the senators want to look at it, which some of the Republicans said they're not even going to look at it, or I guess it's over now, so they didn't look at it at all, because they had already made up their mind. I think it's possible that you could argue that some of the Democratic senators also decided before hearing any testimony or looking at the investigation. There's certainly a number of Republicans that couldn't care less about the accusations of this woman, of these women, but especially of Blasey Ford, who testified right in front of them, and who many of them, again, said was very credible, and that her testimony is very moving. But they only believe her story insofar as that she was sexually assaulted, but of course she couldn't remember that it was Kavanaugh, even though she had reported to her psychiatrist years before that it was him. But yeah, she must be misremembering because it's our guy, so that is what it is. So I'll give you a rundown, some examples of, because basically what we have now is, I'll give you basically a rundown of the vote, and kind of what happened. And I would like to warn everyone beforehand, as I move through this podcast, I'm probably going to say some naughty words and some mean things, especially about the Republicans. But I feel that that pales in comparison to what they just did to a sexual assault survivor, and also just the fact that a lot of the people that we have in Congress are out-and-out ghouls that don't care about the citizens. They don't care about you. They don't care about me. They care about their donors, and they care about the money that they might make from basically being in a position of power. So if you're sexually assaulted, that doesn't really bother them that much. It's not them. It's not their son or daughter that got sexually assaulted. So they would prefer that, especially if you're calling it out against their nominee, that you would just keep your mouth shut. So I imagine many people have seen at least cursory coverage of this debacle that we just experienced as U.S. citizens. So the vote was 50 to 48, which, for anyone with even a basic knowledge of the U.S. government, there are 100 senators. So one might ask themselves, where are the other two? It's a very interesting topic about how that comes out. So before I totally explain that, I will explain some of the major players and how this turned out. As I said, most of the Republicans, as expected, voted yes. In fact, none of them voted no, but that's a little more complicated than that, and I will return to that later. First, I'll talk about Flake. Flake was actually the one that called for the weak investigation, and he only did so, as he admitted himself, because he's not up for re-election. Flake is a Republican from Arizona. I assume he will either be moving on to a lush corporate job, or he will be trying to run for governor of Arizona perhaps, or president at some point. But we discussed in an earlier podcast that basically it's kind of his MO to be a wishy-washy, spineless Republican, which kind of the cookie, the mold that they're all shaped from is they don't really have any principles. It's more about money, which kind of showed with the votes that we had here. Maybe save one, but even that I would argue is maybe being a little too kind to them. So he pushed for the limited investigation, and he got it, and he still ended up voting for Kavanaugh. I don't think that really should surprise anyone. He basically, before he even called for that investigation, said he pushed to go to the vote, but he said we should delay it for 1 week while we do an investigation. I assume that's more for optics than it is for that he gave a shit about a woman who was sexually assaulted, but obviously that's conjecture. It's possible also that he pushed for this due to what Donald Trump called the elevator screamers, meaning two women, one who I believe was sexually assaulted and one who was raped, who tried to call out Jeff Flake before the vote to push the confirmation forward, and told him their stories of one that said, I didn't come out because I didn't think anyone would believe me. I don't know if that would be surprising to anyone now, because that's basically the MO of sexual assault survivors, the 10% that are brave enough to come out, because they basically get victim blamed constantly. It's very difficult to prove a sexual assault allegation, especially when essentially no one believes you, which is often what happens. And there are claims of, they're paid actors, they're trying to ruin the career of the man, even though, especially in this case, that's absolutely laughable, because Blasey Ford is getting death threats and had to move out of her house, and the man she accused of sexually assaulting her and attempting to rape her is in the Supreme Court now. He is basically has a job for life. So anyone that wants to argue that Blasey Ford was coming out to ruin this man's life for political reasons is either a dingbat or you've got some sort of blinders on, or she made the worst calculation ever. But I think she knew exactly what she was getting into, and actually she tried to keep her name secret, I think for this exact reason, because she knew that the troglodyte Republican base would come after her, as they did, because they're basically soulless, spineless people that argue that they're moral creatures, but in fact are vapid, and they're disgusting, violent people that have nothing better to do than troll a sexual assault victim online because she said that maybe the guy that they're trying to back, that their daddy president put out as a candidate, maybe isn't as a sweet twinkle toes choir boy as they thought. So anyway, these two women came out and yelled at him, being Jeff Flake, and so he called for an investigation. So whether that was a political calculation or it was because of these women who were super brave and came out and called him out to his face, or perhaps a little bit of both, maybe we'll never know. But it is most likely, I would say, that he had already made his mind up for the investigation, and certainly before the vote. So I have a few other people. We can look at kind of overarching opinions of this man from the majority and minority leader. The majority leader is Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky. Anyone that's seen them knows that he is clearly a professional turtle impersonator, and he's about 1,000 fucking years old. He referred to Kavanaugh as a superstar and a legendary scholar, but we will see that that's not exactly accurate from Kavanaugh's record later. And I would like to see, as Donald Trump called for Obama's transcripts because a black man couldn't have got good grades, because that's preposterous, and also, he must be a Muslim that was born in Kenya. I would maybe like to call for Kavanaugh's transcripts, because drunken douchebag sexual assaulter, maybe he didn't have time to study so much, But then again, it doesn't matter because he's a rich white man. So he probably is going to get away with that. And I seriously doubt anyone will call for seeing his transcripts. I doubt anyone will listen to the countless people that have come out and called him a liar because he said he had never blacked out. And he only drank to excess on occasions. And, he puked because he ate spicy food. That all sounds very likely. So on the other side, you have Democrat Chuck Schumer from New York. He's one of those somewhat light, too easily pushed over Democrats. But he's not the worst. I shouldn't be too hard on him. He did come out pretty hard against Kavanaugh, saying that Kavanaugh doesn't deserve to be on the bench and that he, quote, repeatedly misled the Senate, unquote, which is, I would say, clear to anyone with eyes and ears. That he constantly misled the people. After I finish running through the major players, I will discuss potential acts of perjury that Kavanaugh committed during the Senate hearings. So let me keep moving on this, and then I will get back to that so we can see whether or not Schumer was right about the fact that Kavanaugh many times ended up misleading the Senate. So the next person I have on my list is Susan Collins. Collins initially showed some apprehension to Kavanaugh. She seemed to think maybe that he was not the greatest candidate. I don't know where she would get that idea. But it's almost clear to everyone. I feel like I don't even have to say allegedly. He was a drunk through high school and college, and some people are speculating that he was drunk during the Senate confirmation process. In the hearings. I would say that's very possible. Anyway, so she showed some initial apprehension to him, but surprise, surprise, she's a Republican from Maine, so she voted yes. So there's actually an interesting development in the Collins story. As she was coming out, showing that she was probably going to vote for Kavanaugh, a PAC called Crowd PAC. There's a number of these PACs now. They basically are trying to fight against the normal PACs and super PACs. And I would like to see them all over, but if we're going to have corporate PACs, I suppose we might as well have these sorts of PACs that are essentially trying to combat the damage done by all the corporate money that we have in the system right now. So Crowd PAC came out and said, they basically told Collins, so if you vote, we're going to raise money right now. And if you vote in favor of Kavanaugh, we will give this money to your opponent because she will be primaried and also have a Democratic challenger in 2020. So they said, if you do that, we'll give them the money. And if you vote no on Kavanaugh, then all the money gets returned to the people that donated it. And it's done. That's good. We'll wash our hands of this deal and you get to go on with your life. So at the time of the confirmation, it had raised about over $2 million, and now it's somewhere at or over $3.5 million. So they have decided that they will give it to the challenger, the Democratic challenger, in 2020. Actually, the site was so flooded with hits right after Collins gave her 45-minute speech where she talked about how difficult this was and how much she believes Dr. Blasey Ford, all to end up saying, oh, well, I'm going to vote for Kavanaugh because I don't care about women. So the site got so many hits after she came out and voted for Kavanaugh that it actually crashed for nearly a day. It was back up after that, and they're still taking donations. So she is going to have quite a challenger coming up here very soon in the next 2 years here. So I want to give you guys a little bit more information on Susan Collins. For those of you who think that maybe she is a moderate because she almost voted against Kavanaugh, or maybe you think that she's not as bad as the vote for Kavanaugh would have you to believe. So she has raised an insane amount of money. So first I'll start with the money that she's raised and who she's raised it from to show you just another example of corruption in politics and how it's real and how normal PACs and corporations do, in fact, influence our politics. And I will subsequently tie that in later with her voting record to show you, one, how bad she is on her voting record in general, and also in some ways how that coalesces with her voting record. So over her career, she's raised over $21 million, $244,022. In 2008 alone, she has raised $6,255,694. And these are all, you can see these numbers at opensecrets.org. I strongly recommend everyone go there. I also got some information from votesmart.org and 538, who has pretty good pollings, especially when you want to compare someone and their voting record to Trump. So I really strongly suggest everyone get out there and check out all of those facts and all of those websites. They are very, very good examples. So keep in mind that she said that she has come out against this crowd pack and saying that it is quote-unquote quid pro quo. So at the same time, she's taken over $21 million, and this year alone, she's taken over $6 million from corporations. And if that's not bribery, I don't know what is, because if someone gives you, say they even give you a couple $100, they expect you to do what they ask you after that, let alone giving you tens of millions of dollars. You don't think she does whatever when her corporate donors come calling? Who in their right mind believes that she doesn't bend the knee and say, whatever you say, I'll do anything you guys want me to do? That's absolutely what has happened. So one of her top donors is General Dynamics, which is a defense company, and you can look at her record, and she's voted for basically every large-scale war that we've had in the past. Another of her biggest donors, MBNA, which is now part of Bank of America, so big banks. She also takes a lot of money from big banks. You can see that when she votes for deregulation on Wall Street, which she has consistently done. She also takes money from large law firms. One of her top donors on that front is DLA Piper. She has also taken money from investment firms such as Elliott Management, Cohen Group, which is a business advisory group. She's taken money from Blue Cross Blue Shield, so she takes money to vote against healthcare on a regular basis. And actually, one of the ones that really surprised me was she's taken a lot of money from New Balance this year, like a couple tens of thousands of dollars from them, which I thought was a little strange, but I assume that would be to do some sort of deregulation or something to that effect. Or maybe they just like the way she looks in their new kicks. Getting to some of the voting record more in depth, because I made a lot of mentions of her voting record. You can, like I said, I would strongly advise you to go check places like VoteSmart, 538, and also Open Secrets. All those are very good places to find information about her voting record. So, according to 538, she votes with Trump 79.5% of the time. She has voted in favor of torture because she voted to put Gina Haspel, known torturer, as director of the CIA. She voted for the repeal of guidelines that were meant to protect borrowers from discrimination on auto loans. She voted for rolling back Dodd-Frank. I can talk about this a little bit more in a different part of the podcast. So basically, Dodd-Frank, for a quick rundown, basically tries to curtail some of the corruption in the big banks and stop them from doing so much gambling with your money. Basically the stuff that caused the financial crisis in 2008 and will lead to our next crash. We probably have another year to 2 years on that in America. So continuing on, she also voted for reauthorization of warrantless spying with the NSA. She voted to send arms to Saudi Arabia, something that our good buddy Joe Manchin also did, which also, as I'll talk about later, recently killed a school bus full of children in Yemen. So, continuing on, she voted to repeal a rule that would have allowed local governments to establish a new type of retirement plan for workers. So, basically, Republicans always want to argue that they are states' rights people. They're in favor of states' rights. Clearly, this is an example of her not being in favor of states' rights because she took that right away from the states. But we all know that Republicans are huge hypocrites when it comes to this. They won't let a lot of states, some of the presidents have tried to cut down on legal marijuana, including Trump and his little ghoul, Jeff Sessions. They want to cut down on states' rights and those issues. They basically only want states' rights when it hurts people of color or when it fills their pocketbooks. Continuing on, she voted to repeal a rule that barred the FCC from sharing your data, your activities, however they feel. So she doesn't really care about your personal rights and your data, both with the NSA and the FCC. She's in favor of them taking all your information and doing with it what they please. Lastly, she also voted to get rid of a rule that would have forced employers to make and to document accurate records of injuries and illnesses on the job. So she also clearly doesn't care about the normal worker. Again, there is a huge list on the internet of all the terrible things she's voted for. She's not a good person. She's not a moderate. I would argue that there are no more moderate Republicans. So there you go. Basically, we need to get in there and we need to stop these corrupt politicians. We need to get money out of politics. And I think that will do a great step to ending the corruption in politics, because if these politicians cannot take money from large corporations, then they will be forced to go either work in the private sector or they will be forced to work for the people instead of working for their pocketbook. And I hope that is what she will do when she gets primaried and loses to the Democrat in 2020. So, as if that wasn't enough hypocrisy for one sitting, she has also derided former Senator Al Franken for his sexual harassment. I think he should be derided. It's not good. It's disgusting. You should, of course, never sexually harass anyone. However, Franken was not accused of attempted rape, and she still supports Kavanaugh, who is also an alleged multiple times sexual assaulter and also an attempted rapist. But I think that gets down to the nitty-gritty of Republican ethos, and that is be principled unless it's someone that's not in our tribe. So if the person is on our team, well, that's all right, let it go. And everyone can be like this, but the Republicans are notorious for it. They do it pretty much all the time, and they just want to call out Democrats when they do it. To give you a few examples of this, you have these Republicans that always ask, where are you going to get the money for Medicare for All, even though, even from a Mercator Institute study, it is cheaper than our current healthcare system. But they never ask for things like the illegal wars that we're in. They never try to ask for things like that. The money is just there. It's in the ether. We just snatch it when we need to kill some brown people. We need to build a border wall. Those things are, of course, they're in the national security interest or whatever sort of mealy-mouth argument they want to make. So that doesn't matter. But you want to keep people from dying. You want to ensure the 30 million people that are without health insurance under the Trump regime. You want to help people that are homeless. Around 500,000 Americans that are homeless, 40,000 homeless veterans in America. Well then, where are you going to get the money for that, They cut taxes for the rich and sunset taxes for the average American. It makes sense. Trickle-down economics has been showed that it doesn't work since Reagan in the 80s. But yeah, it's okay. We don't need to. They only care about debt and deficit when they're not, when they don't control the presidency. All right, so I should move on, or I could rant about Republican hypocrisy all day, because I think they are shills and they are corrupt, and we should vote them out of office, and we should destroy the Republican Party until they can rebuild themselves as if you want to be conservative, that's fine, but you got to bring some principle to it. You cannot just be partisan hacks all the time. Democrats, they do that too, but the hypocrisy on the right is always on showcase. Next, after Collins, we have Senator Murkowski from Alaska. Like Collins, she is a Republican, and like Collins, she also showed a little bit of apprehension and some actual critical thinking, at least it seemed. With Collins, who knows if she actually had apprehension, but it did seem, at least to me, that she did, at least for a time, genuinely think about it, but it's hard to say. Anyway, so she might have voted, referring to Murkowski, on principle. It's very hard to say, but she might have also voted out of pressure. This pressure coming from the governor and lieutenant governor of her state, who were both against Kavanaugh. And I think they were against him for good reasons. They both believed that he would be bad for healthcare. I think that's pretty obvious with the things that he thinks and has said about Obamacare. And they also think that he would be bad for the native peoples of Alaska, which also seems to be fair, especially how he seems to feel about the environment, which would be bad for everybody. Even for me, who is half the world away in Taiwan, the things that he might do based on climate change votes could be disastrous and could kill everyone in the world. So Murkowski actually didn't end up even voting no. What she did was she voted present, which is basically a vote neither way. She basically threw her hands up and said, "I'm not participating." This brings us to the reason she did that, which is Steve Danis, who is a Republican from Montana. So she voted present because he was not present. He was at the time attending his daughter's wedding, and even though he was absent from the vote, he did still watch the vote on TV, and through a very hacky video, in my opinion, recorded by his son, he did say "I" when his name was called. So he obviously was quite in favor of Brett Kavanaugh. Basically, the video shows him watching the TV with the vote going on, and he kind of says "I" and just kind of looks like a smug asshole. Which I assume he is. So I'll back my feelings of him being a smug asshole up with the fact that if anyone follows politics moderately close, you might remember there was a time when Elizabeth Warren was attempting to read a letter from Coretta Scott King, who is the widow of the late Martin Luther King Jr., and he invoked an ancient rule, Senate Rule 19, because he said he thought that her reading that would impugn Jeff Sessions, who is a monstrous weasel that thinks good people don't smoke marijuana. So that's pretty much his character. Daines basically didn't seem to care a whole lot about this vote as long as it passed. He more cares about looking good. But it is what it is. It's quite unsurprising for most of us, I feel. He's, just another Republican bad guy that I have a lot of trouble feeling any sympathy for, as he basically vacated his post to go to his daughter's wedding and proceeded to make a spectacle out of it by recording a video and posting it online, as opposed to just staying out of the public spotlight and just letting the vote happen because he knew that Kavanaugh would be appointed. He could have tweeted something out afterwards, but even at his daughter's wedding, which he vacated his duty to the American people to go to, he had to make it all about him. But surprisingly, he's not the biggest asshole in this situation. This might be unsurprising to people that have had a lot of conversations with me, especially about Ari and I before had a discussion about Blue Dog Democrats. Ari's a little bit friendlier to them than I am. I think he also probably doesn't like them, but he has more of an understanding for them than I do. I believe that they're weak. I believe that they're bad at messaging. And so in turn, they basically are Republican light, and that is why most of them don't continue to be in their seats. One of them that has, for multiple terms, is the Democrat that is the bane of my existence. Some of you can probably already guess who that is. That is number one Democratic piece of shit, Joe Manchin. Anyone that doesn't know, Joe Manchin is a Democrat, using air quotes, from West Virginia. He voted to confirm Kavanaugh. He basically is. I talked to Ari about this last time. I argued that he's a Republican. We actually did find out that he's not as radical as I thought he was. He only votes with Trump 60% of the time, as opposed to maybe the 4 or 5% that he should. But I will admit that I was surprised that he didn't vote as much with him as he could have. Basically, Manchin's record is really bad for a Democrat. He's pro-choice, though I will make the caveat of saying he has occasionally voted for, I guess, in some ways helping or at least not punishing abortion providers. But a lot of these quote-unquote abortion providers are generally things like Planned Parenthood, where essentially less than 5% of all of their activities include abortions. Most of it is actually healthcare for women, especially poor women and women of color, who are vastly underrepresented, and the Republicans basically try to fuck over at every turn. So some other things that I think he's terrible on: he's anti-Dodd-Frank. For anyone that doesn't know about Dodd-Frank is essentially weak legislation that would have tried to slightly regulate the big banks a little bit more. It was basically designed to prevent them from gambling with your money. In 2008, there was a giant recession. We saw a giant economic crash, and that was due to financial institutions gambling with your money. Money that you put into places like Goldman Sachs and the like. Basically, they were giving subprime mortgages to people that couldn't afford them. They bought the ratings companies that controlled the ratings of these mortgages, and they rated them AAA, and then they gave them to people, and then they basically played the market against those mortgages. They knew that they would fail, and so they put their eggs in that basket, and eventually the whole market crashed. And then, instead of punishing those bankers, they were bailed out because they're too big to fail. And in turn, the heads of those companies left those companies with golden parachutes, which is essentially, basically, they used American tax money to give criminals millions and millions of dollars as an exit bonus. So Joe Manchin voted against regulating these banks, and it was a very weak legislation that did not go nearly far enough, in my opinion, but he couldn't even get behind that. He also voted in favor of Trump's $350 million arms deal to best friend of the United States, Saudi Arabia, who only recently let women drive and who locked up a lot of the women and would like to execute a lot of the women that push for that right. Not only that, a lot of these Republicans want to go to war with people because they claim that they're scared of radical Islamic terrorism. You have people like Trump even saying, say what it is. Why can't Obama say what it is? It's radical Islamic terrorism. I believe was 16 of the 19, more than half of the 9/11 hijackers. Where were they from? They're from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia practices Wahhabi Islam. It's one of the strictest forms of Islam. Women essentially have no rights. They're not allowed to go basically out of the house without a male guide. They must be covered from head to toe. And Saudi Arabia supports numerous terrorist groups in the Middle East. They do things like bomb hospitals for the blind. They do things like, recently they blew up a bus full of school children. And where did the bomb that they did that with come from? That's right, it's the U.S. So Joe Manchin voted for that. He voted to drop bombs on school children because he wanted to back best friend of the United States, Saudi Arabia, a dictatorship that demolishes its citizens. It holds them in very low regard, especially if they are not rich. So the current dictator there is Mohammed bin Salman. He basically just did a soft coup and kidnapped a lot of the other leaders there. But Joe Manchin thinks that guy should have millions of dollars in U.S. arms. Continuing on, as if that wasn't enough, he's in favor of the border wall, which, yeah, we don't really need to talk about how that's just a waste of time and resources. Also, he wanted to reschedule hydrocodone, basically a high-level painkiller, to Schedule 2 because they have a big problem with opioids in West Virginia. I would argue the problem there is not with necessarily the use of some of these drugs. I feel the problem is obviously multifaceted. Part of it is overprescription by doctors, but you have to be careful with that because if some people have pain, they also need to get the right prescriptions to deal with that pain. I think the bigger problem that you have is you have people living in abject poverty in West Virginia because of right-wing policies that Joe Manchin is so commonly in favor of. Instead of rebuilding infrastructure and creating jobs, Manchin supports a lot of the ideas that Trump has that end up outsourcing jobs. It also ends up sending a lot of money on our defense budget that is bigger than something like the next 7 or 9 countries below us combined, instead of using that money for building jobs programs, building roads, building bridges, maybe creating healthcare, which is a huge deal for Americans. It's something like 60% of Americans currently can't afford a $1,000 emergency. So in the richest country that the face of the world has ever seen, I feel like that sort of abject poverty is unacceptable. And when people live in such abject poverty, surprisingly enough, sometimes they try to escape. And they do that in various different ways. A lot of times that ends up being drugs. So when you're helpless, yeah, sometimes you try to escape. So I think the answer to that is not to take away pain medication that could be used in the right way. It's to take away that feeling of helplessness, dread that these right-wing policies have forced upon the lower 50% or more of the American population. Basically, I can keep going forever on Manchin. He's basically the fucking worst. I really hope that they can vote this guy out. He just won his primary against a wonderful, strong progressive, Paula Jean Swearengin. A lot of that was name recognition. Paula Jean didn't take any corporate PAC money. She was all self-funded, and she still got a good amount of the vote for running against an incumbent as someone who had no prior experience. She worked her ass off, and I think that the next go-round, I really hope she runs again, and I hope she wins, because this guy has got to go. Manchin is basically the worst. I'll give you a few more examples. He was anti-marriage equality up until at least 2015. He voted against the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which basically, for anyone who doesn't know what Don't Ask, Don't Tell is, it was basically the military said, if you're gay, we won't ask, you don't tell, which basically was terrible for people that were homosexual in the military. And for as big of this warmongers as the right is, it seems like they shouldn't really care about who you find attractive when they're sending you to die in a pointless war for oil. But I guess that's my opinion. Continuing on here with this list of absolutely abhorrent things. He voted for the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton, of all people, who also not a great guy, and his wife also a corporate shill. So surprisingly enough, all these corporatists seem to get together and vote for the same terrible legislation. Defense of Marriage Act essentially defined marriage as between a man and a woman. So it was trying to get rid of gay marriage by saying, well, a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or whatever other gender you might define yourself as, you can't marry unless you are a man and a woman. And of course, in more recent news, 2017, which is just last year, he voted for Trump's tax cuts, which again, talking about the poverty in West Virginia, just exasperates the problem. A lot of Republicans want to talk about, wow, Trump cut taxes for everyone. essentially the tax cuts that go to the middle and lower classes are negligible. You probably won't notice them, especially it's probably going to actually be a net loss as both inflation increases and as they continue to gut Obamacare, which is also a Republican bill. Let's get Medicare for all in there pretty soon before our people that are a little poorer in the country start to die at even higher rates. I believe currently, like I said, there's about 30 million people without health care, and we have between 35 and 41 or 42,000 people that die every year because of a lack of health care. So we kind of need to get on that, unless people are just out and out okay with poor people dying in America because they're not giving a right that most of the other quote-unquote developed countries in the world have. Okay. So those are most of the people that I wanted to talk about. Of course, I really never want to talk about Joe Manchin because he is the bane of my existence. I'll move on to some examples of during the hearings, the proceedings to talk to both Kavanaugh and Dr. Blasey Ford. Some of the instances where Kavanaugh may or may not have perjured himself. So I can give you a few examples of that, which might be relevant in the future. All right. So when we begin to move into a lot of the perjury allegations that people have come forward with, that it seems maybe Kavanaugh may have lied to the Senate, as was stated by multiple people. There's a lot of good reporting on this. So I'd like to say for a lot of my sources on this, I went to the failing New York Times, as Donald Trump would say. I got a lot of information from Vox, and there's a few other websites. I think there was some MSNBC stuff I took. I obviously got some information off Wikipedia, so I really encourage people to not just listen to this. I, of course, love when people listen to this, but I strongly encourage you to go do your own research. And also, if you don't agree, I would love to hear your feedback, both positive or negative, and let's have a discussion about this. But I think a lot of this stuff, perjury stuff, is a little more vague. But I think a lot of the overarching premises that I've discussed are a little bit more difficult to argue. But if you have legitimate, educated argument, I'd love to hear it. I don't want to hear bullshit arguments, though. Please don't come with me that this was to destroy a man's career. These allegations of sexual assault. Don't come at me with women are liars. Don't come at me with something about the Republicans are principled. Or politicians in general are principled. Don't come at me with there's no corruption. Any of these sorts of things. If you think that, you can say it. But I'm going to come at you with a lot of facts. And if you can't wrap your head around those facts, I would prefer that you just sit down and keep yourself regulated to your friend sphere that basically just supports the silly ideas that keep propping up the right. All right, so I'll get into this so I don't get on too deep of a rant, because I'm very... You can probably tell this is a much more somber podcast. I'm incredibly dismayed and upset and heartbroken about these recent developments, and that is me as a white guy who is straight and cisgendered, and I also live in a different country, so I'm greatly unaffected by most of this. But it breaks my heart for the women and people of color and poor people, poor white people even, in America that basically have to potentially deal with decades and decades of a Republican-led Supreme Court that doesn't give a scintilla of a shit about you anymore. And you have a president and a Republican-led House and Congress that also could not care less about you. They care about themselves, they care about their rich friends, and they care about their corporate donors. And you don't cross their mind, whether you vote for them or not. They don't care about you. So, anyway, moving on. So the first example of perjury or potential perjury that happened was Kavanaugh basically said about his drinking that he never blacked out. He basically only went so far as there were a few times where he drank too many beers. And if anyone remembers this part of the testimony, basically he, instead of being measured and just answering the questions coolly and collectedly, he got very offended that anyone would question whether he could handle his drinking. He basically devolved into ad hominem attacks. One senator asked him, have you ever drank too much, or do you have a drinking problem? And he responded like a child and said, no, do you? No, do you? I don't have a drinking problem, do you? And initially he just said, do you? And she said, excuse me, can you answer the questions? Like, hey bud, I'm not the one on trial here. I'm not the one doing a job interview. If anyone else acted like that during a job interview, they'd be immediately told to don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out because you're acting like a spoiled brat. But of course, we're in an insane, topsy-turvy, upside-down world. So that was seen as strength as opposed to someone who can't control their temper and can't control themselves on the court. And obviously doesn't have great judgment, as he came out afterwards and said, I've never acted like this before, etc., etc., apologizing for his actions. So anyway, continuing on, he basically, he said he didn't drink too much, he never blacked out, but there's a plethora of evidence that shows that he was, if not an out-and-out alcoholic, he was a very, very heavy drinker in high school and college. And there's no evidence that stopped there. Many of his former classmates and roommates have come forward. For a prime example, Chad Ludington said that this kind of seemed to be a farce. He said, but he didn't even claim that the drinking was essentially the problem. He said, the issue is not that you drank. I think anyone, if you're in your free time, you drink a little too much, it is what it is, You did what you did, you got a little drunk, that's all right. Even if you blacked out, as long as you didn't try to rape someone, which he's accused of trying to do. But even that aside, if you just drank too much, maybe you acted stupid, which there are obviously accusations of him acting quite silly, especially in Mark Judge's book, where it's almost certain that he was referring to Kavanaugh, but again, we can't be sure. Basically, Ludington said, it's not the drinking that's the issue, it's the fact that you're willing to come out and lie about it, which I think most people can get on board with, is that if you come out and lie about the fact that you didn't really have a drinking problem, but you did, that's a clear lie, which would in fact mean that he perjured himself. The next potential opportunity for perjury came when he was discussing his yearbook. So a big part was he used a lot of examples, a lot of words, terms, where he said things like boof, and they asked, what does boof mean? And he said, it means flatulence. It refers to flatulence. And he kind of laughed the thing off as if it was silly. But basically anyone that's familiar with that term would note that it refers to anal sex. I don't think anyone has ever said, I boofed last night, and they meant that they farted. The second one was the Devil's Triangle. If you look up the Devil's Triangle online, you will find that it refers to a threesome, a sexual encounter with 2 men and 1 woman. And Kavanaugh basically said that that was not the case. It, in fact, referred to a drinking game. And when he was asked to elaborate on how that game was played, he said, "Have you ever played quarters?" And the senator replied, "No." And he said, basically, you take 3 shot glasses and it's a game like quarters. And that was all the description that he seemed to be able to muster. If you were to ask my opinion, I would say that's all the most he had thought about of the lie that he was going to tell. But again, that's getting back into my opinion, and who knows what he actually meant by that. Another quick thing is that I believe is on the site Urban Dictionary, that directly after he made that statement, there was, because you can go and add definitions to words on Urban Dictionary, similar to before when Wikipedia was more accessible. Now there's more oversight, so it's a little bit more credible and locked down. But anyway, so someone made a post on there that defined, I believe it was the Devil's Triangle, as a drinking game. And they looked at the IP address, and it was a White House IP address. So if that's not a little, I don't know how you would describe that. Maybe you would describe it just as them trying to rig the game in his favor, give him a little bit of an out, whoever may have made that edit. So not only does the internet basically prove that he was not giving the best definitions for the terms that he was using, but some of his classmates from Georgetown Prep, the religious private high school that he went to, also came out after the fact and said that this was not the meaning of the term Devil's Triangle, that it did in fact refer to a sexual act. Another example of his potential perjuring of himself was he was involved in the nomination of William Pryor, who was a justice that was being nominated in 2004. He was a pretty controversial figure. He was anti-Roe v. Wade. If you wonder about what he thought about Roe v. Wade, when I call him an anti-Roe v. Wade judge, Pryor called Roe v. Wade, quote, "the worst abomination in the history of constitutional law," unquote. So Kavanaugh said that he was, quote, "not involved in the handling of this nomination." However, there are emails that showed he was strategizing. He called in one of the emails for a conference call to, quote, "coordinate plans and efforts," end quote. And this was when Kavanaugh was working on the White House counsel's office in the early 2000s. This was around 2003, 2004. And basically he was fighting for Pryor, but when they brought that up, he lied about it. So that's another potential route for people to call for perjury charges, because that seems to be quite a clear lie. The next example we have of potential perjury would be he improperly obtained some Democratic files. So this again happened when he was working in the White House counsel office. This was in 2004. In 2004, 2 Senate staffers engaged in what was called unauthorized and possibly illegal spying. Basically, they were reading Democrat memorandums on strategy via the Senate computer system. So they were not supposed to be doing this. These are Republican staffers. They're spying on the Democrats through this computer server. And I'm sorry, not a computer server. It's a computer system. Basically the same idea. And so Kavanaugh had claimed to have never have seen any of these documents. However, there's evidence that shows that he did actually receive some of these exact documents. So there's yet another example of him possibly flat out lying to the Senate committee in charge of his pushing through and eventually being confirmed. So the last example I have of potential perjury, at some point I might try to do some more research, maybe watch again over the confirmation hearings. But I was trying to get this out moderately quick because this is pretty hot news right now, and I felt not only morally obligated to put something out here, basically detailing what is wrong with candidate Kavanaugh and the Republicans and the one Democrat, Joe Manchin, again, that voted to confirm him so quickly after a sham, or at least a under-investigated FBI investigation. So the last thing I have here is that Kavanaugh, and it basically relates to Kavanaugh and his involvement in the Bush torture program. So Kavanaugh said that he had no involvement in the torture program. However, Illinois Senator Dick Durbin showed two examples that show Kavanaugh was, in fact, at a meeting. Basically, this meeting was debating whether enemy combatants should be giving lawyers when they are being detained. So this is, again, another piece of evidence that shows that he says one thing, but there's clear evidence to show that, in fact, he was either didn't have the memory to correctly remember these things, or that he was out and out lying, trying to cover his ass. So those are kind of your two arguments. Like I said, maybe I'll try to write an article on this to give you guys a little bit more in-depth viewing of this, but right now I feel like I need to get out here, even though I'm angered, upset, feeling a little bit depressed about the future of America. I felt like it was kind of my duty to get out here and give you guys the information that I had and had researched in the basically the day after the Kavanaugh hearing, and what I had accumulated over the confirmation hearings and during the time of the investigation. Even though I just gave you 5 bullet points, 5 examples of why Kavanaugh basically perjured himself, and those could be debated. I'm willing to have an open debate about whether those constitute perjury or not. It's somewhat of a moot point because of how difficult it is to invoke perjury charges against anyone, as we can see throughout the U.S. history. That being said, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of basically how you impeach someone and the likelihood or routes that the Democrats might want to take and some Republicans might want to get on board with if they have a soul, which I'm not holding out for. So suffice it to say that impeaching anyone in the U.S. is not easy. It's a very, very difficult process. So impeachment in the Constitution comes from Article 2, Section 4, and basically it says that you are allowed to impeach the president, the vice president, and, quote, all civil officers of the U.S., end quote. And you can do this for treason, for bribery, or, quote, other high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. So to give some fun facts from history, only one person from the legislature has ever been impeached, and that was in 1976. It was U.S. Senator William Blunt, but actually he was later acquitted of these charges because the Senate decided that he was not a civil officer. So we said you can impeach president, VP, and civil officers of the U.S. So other examples is the House has impeached 13 judges over its course, and the Senate has then gone on to uphold 8 of those convictions, and some of them were Supreme Court justices. One example of that was Walter Nixon, who in 1989 was removed for perjury. that kind of strikes a nerve here. So then you may ask, okay, how does one actually impeach the Supreme Court justice or anyone else? But here we're specifically looking at a Supreme Court justice. So to impeach someone, you need the majority in the House, which is the lower house of our legislature. And then after that, you need a supermajority, which is 2/3 of Senate votes. So you would need 67 people in the Senate. So that would be incredibly difficult, just because, they just approved him, and one of the people that you would expect to vote against him, at least even if you just voted on party lines, which is mostly how the vote worked out, Joe Manchin decided to go to the other side and vote for installment of Kavanaugh. So even if you kept party lines right now, the best you're going to get is a 49-51 vote if you still have one Republican coming over to vote against the impeachment of Kavanaugh. So it's very unlikely that would happen. Some might argue that the midterms are coming up, and I would implore you, please get out in the midterms in November and vote. Do as much research as you can. Try to find as many sources as you can for who your House, Senate, gubernatorial, all of those people, even local people. Find out what their policy platforms are and find the people who are populist, who are progressive, who want to do the best things for the American people, and get out there and vote for them. Cast your vote for these people because it is incredibly important. That being said, it is very, very unlikely that in 2018 that the Senate will flip. The House has a better potential, but is more likely that you would be struck by lightning while simultaneously being eaten by a shark, that the Senate will flip in 2018. It is almost impossible. It's very close right now. So it's possible that the Senate might flip 51-49, but that still leaves you 16 votes short of a supermajority. So even if you still had one Republican coming over to vote on your side, or even if you could find some good evidence and you get a couple of them to flip, you still need about 10 extra seats, even if you got 4 or 5, which is almost impossible. So it's very unlikely that at least until 2020 that we will have a serious flip in the Senate. I do think that going forward, this is going to have a big impact on the Republican Party, and hopefully also Joe Manchin, with people lashing out against them for putting Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. But the reality of the situation is, in the next month, when we have the midterms, it is very unlikely that the Democrats even take the Senate, let alone obtain any sort of thing approaching a supermajority. So I just want you all to prepare yourselves. That being said, in the next month before the midterms, I would implore people to get in the streets, talk to your friends and neighbors, convince them that they need to vote for the right candidates, and then simultaneously push the candidates that we have and the candidates that are trying to get into office to vote in the right way, to push for Kavanaugh to be impeached, and also to push for things that we need in this country, like Medicare for all, like ending Citizens United. You have to push your elected representatives in the correct direction. If we don't, we are going to see more of the same that we've been seeing for decades in this country, of the Overton window shifting to the right, and us as middle and lower class Americans getting a smaller and smaller piece of the pie as the uber wealthy continue to control more and more of wealth and more of our government.
So I cannot stress enough how important it is to get involved politically. If you want to hear why I think you need to do so, you can listen to our last episode where I make the case that the most important thing in your life, whether you think so or not, is politics. Whether you view yourself as an apolitical being or you think that you don't have a voice, the more you vote, the more you push your representatives, the more you push your friends and family to vote for the right things and to be held accountable, the better this will get. And the more people grow apathetic and throw up their hands and say, fuck this, I have no say, and I don't care anymore, the worse it's going to get for people, especially people on the lowest rungs of society. Those being poor people, people of color, people who live quote unquote alternative lifestyles, people that are LGBTQ plus, people that are transgender. It is going to get much worse for us as a society in general, barring the top few percentiles of the US economy. It will get worse for us, and it will continue to get worse until we get into the streets and we say enough is enough. You cannot continue to hold us under your thumb. We are the majority. We are this in some cases the quite too silent majority. So if you are okay with regulating yourself to wage slavery and a minimum wage that you can barely feed one person on, let alone a family, then I would say you need to never complain about anything. You need to be quiet, sit down, and just sit in your little corner and do your thing. But if you give a shit and you feel like you're getting fucked over because you are, then you need to stand up and we need to do something. Whether that's marching in the street, whether that's confronting your local politician and saying, hey bud, these are the facts, you need to get on our side, or I will do everything in my power to make sure that no one ever votes for you again. You have to do something. You cannot simply sit on your ass and expect things to get better, because it will not. The money that we have in our system will not allow us to improve our system. It is a disgusting cycle that as rich people get more power, they will in turn empower themselves more so they can attain more wealth and more power in the society. And that is going to continue until we rise up as the lower echelons of the society that are much greater in numbers. Until we do that, they do not feel threatened. You must make these people feel threatened. And I'm not talking about physical violence. I'm talking about the power structures in America. You have to show them that we are, as a group, stronger than they are, because we still live in somewhat of a democratic system. Granted, both George Bush and our current president got elected with a minority of the vote, but the more we push our elected representatives to make our system more and more democratic, and we tell them, you are only in your position because of us, and we will take that away from you in a second if you do not represent us and you do not make this country better and more democratic and better for the lowest people in this country. So we cannot allow this to continue. So in terms of that, in a more tangible way that you can, examples of where you can say, at least in terms of Kavanaugh, because of course you can say to your representatives, we need health care. Look at any other developed nation, they have health care. You can say, we need to protect our environment. All these other countries are protecting the environment, and we're reversing regulations. And that's going to lead to the destruction of not only our country, but our world. But to focus back to our main point that I'm talking about today, which is Kavanaugh, if we don't push people to fight, to get him off the Supreme Court, or I'll come back to some things at the end where we can
potentially do other things as Democratic progressives, or even as just, even if you're a Republican, you think of yourself as a Republican, there are things that can be done that could mitigate his time on the Supreme Court and the decisions that he makes. But to focus back on this is why if we don't do this, we are fucked. We are in a boatload of trouble. We are currently on the Titanic, and we have about 5% of the population trying to bail out the water with a bunch of buckets. We are in deep, and if you don't think we're in trouble in America, then you are not paying attention. So basically, I'll give you a rundown of his policies and why he's going to be bad on the Supreme Court. Very, very bad for law and order and justice in America. So the first point that I'll talk about is affirmative action. So in 1999, he voted against affirmative action in college applications, and he argued that Hawaii law that allowed Native Hawaiians only to vote in elections for the opposite of Hawaiian affairs was racist. So we can have a debate about affirmative action, but I believe in the current state of America, it is in some ways necessary. As you guys know, if you have talked to me about politics, or you have listened to the previous podcast, I am not a huge identity politics, affirmative action guy. But right now there is a vast underrepresentation in America of women, of people of color, of LGBT plus people. So right now, until we fix those problems, until we get accurate representation and equal treatment under the law, then I think affirmative action is necessary. And calling an island that the U.S. annexed and took control of from the native people, like we did the U.S. in general, calling their self-rule of the island racist is a little bit farcical. And that's kind of the pot calling the kettle a racist, in my opinion. So yeah, I can't really get on board with his call for that. Again, I would like to get away from affirmative action, but I feel like until we create a more egalitarian society where it's more merit-based and everyone has equal opportunity under the law, not equal outcome, but equal opportunity, then we need to have some programs that allow for this when there is clear racism built into our institutions. You have to get away from that before you get rid of these sorts of programs. The next topic that I'll talk about is financial regulation. So he said that the Consumer Financial Bureau was unconstitutional. This bureau was created by Elizabeth Warren, and essentially it is to just that. It's to protect the average American citizen from fraud, from especially large corporations. So there are, you can get online and see multiple instances of people trying to commit fraud against poor people or unsuspecting people, perhaps old people or people with some sort of disability, and screwing them over. And the average person who is not super involved or doesn't check up on what someone is doing to them may not see how they're getting screwed. And so it was this bureau's job to look into these things, these businesses, and when they would do something corrupt like this, they would sue on behalf of the consumers. And if you were involved in that, they would basically send you a check saying, hey, bud, we found out that this corporation, maybe some insurance scheme or something, basically they sold you a false bill of goods. They were trying to screw you over, so here's your money back, essentially. And he said that was unconstitutional because he's a big business cuck and doesn't really care about the little guy. So the next one I have for you is taxes. He said that the IRS does not have power to regulate tax preparers. He said this in 2014 because the IRS argued that their tax preparers should be certified.
there's further arguments about this saying, okay, the IRS basically said, well, if you want to, check a box basically that says you are not a qualified preparer, you can still prepare, but you can't just prepare as an official person who is supposed to be preparing taxes without some sort of certification, which I feel is overly fair. And in addition, I feel that as an average person, filing your taxes is not super difficult. It's not the easiest process in the world, but I've filed my own taxes since I was 16, I believe, 15 or 16. I've had some help. I definitely got some help, especially the first couple years from my father, who taught me basically how to do it. But after that, I basically did it online by myself, which is a little bit privileged because often if you want to file on, I wouldn't necessarily file online always, but sometimes you need to pay for services such as like TurboTax, things like that. You maybe need to pay $40 or $50. And for a family, that might even be feasible. At the time, I was a high school and college kid, and in high school, I was living with my parents, obviously, so that wasn't too bad. And in college, I think I generally would do it for free and maybe pay a little fee for my state taxes. But anyway, in general, I feel like it's not that difficult. But if you're going to be filing for someone, you need to be have some sort of accreditation. I don't feel like that's unfair. But certainly, it seems that he has it a little bit out for the IRS, which a lot of conservatives do, and this is a little bit tangential. It's not exactly connected, but I would like to say that I've seen a number of people that I know, especially on Facebook, called taxation fraud. If you think taxation is fraud, I would encourage you to move to a desert island and fend for yourself, because there's a thing that apparently some people are unaware of called the social contract. So basically, you give the government your taxes and they provide you with things like roads and bridges, and they should provide you with things like health care. So if you want to say that the government is not holding up their end of the deal, I will get on that march with you, and we should march to Washington and say, hey, boys and girls in the government, mostly old white boys, you need to hold up your end of the deal, because we give you a shitload of money in taxes, and essentially all you do is kill brown people in the Middle East, and our infrastructure gets a grade of D+ from the Society of Civil Engineers. You're failing us on your end of the bargain. And so if you're going to give tax cuts for the rich, then you need to figure out a way to get some more money that's not from the pockets of poor people. And you need to get your act together, and you need to build us some new roads and some new bridges, and you need to get us health care, and you need to protect your citizens, because that's the fuck we give you money. And if you can't do that, then yeah, you can say, I don't want to pay my tax anymore. And I would be in favor of some sort of strike where people don't pay taxes. I'm in a little bit of a privileged position because I live in another country, and I don't make a ton of money. So because I make less than $100,000 a year, I make significantly less than $100,000 a year. I don't need to pay tax to the federal government. But I think that if people want to say, because you're not holding up your deal, you are robbing us, that would be a fair argument. But arguing that taxation in general is theft is asinine. I think if you're arguing that, you need to really research social contract and the idea of living in a society supported by taxes. And maybe if you have a big problem with that, stop driving on the roads, don't ever call the police, forget about the fire department, things like that. So anyway, moving on from that rant. So on the environment and climate change, he's been critical of Obama's EPA rules that protect the natural, beautiful environment that the U.S. has, the gorgeous forests, mountain ranges. We have beautiful deserts here, the Grand Canyon. We have beautiful national parks in the U.S., and he apparently doesn't give a shit about those wonderful natural places. He instead would rather us pollute them and see those things destroyed for future generations. Though he would argue, he said that this is not because of politics. Of course, he's a very apolitical judge, as all of them claim to be. But he said, actually, that was a procedural issue, and that Congress must make the decision. Even saying that he even did go so far, and bless his heart for this, he admitted that humans are, quote unquote, contributing to climate change. But I think if he actually thought this, he would do a little bit more to fight for, the EPA. And so I'll get into this a little bit more later, but this kind of gets into the Chevron doctrine. And again, I'll give a better description of the Chevron doctrine later, but basically the Chevron doctrine argues that as an agency, you are allowed to interpret basically ambiguous rules so long as you are deemed rational and reasonable. Again, I'll give a better description later, but this basically begins to show that he, as much as he wants to call himself apolitical, which is could be an argument against most of the judges. They claim to be apolitical, but obviously they're political beings. Almost everyone is. But as he argues that, he is actually arguing against precedent, because the Chevron doctrine is old precedent on the Supreme Court. So it seems that he is trying to play the apolitical card while actually being quite political. Okay, so in addition to the fact that basically seems to be opposed to climate change regulations, as a lot of the Republicans are, and even some quote-unquote moderate, aka moderate Democrats, aka Blue Dog Democrats, aka Republican lights, like Joe Manchin. They're fighting science. The Earth has been warming in general. It's better to call it climate change because, as you can see, summers are getting hotter, winters are getting colder. So it's not just warming in general, of course. You have stupid senators and people in the House doing things like throwing snowballs and saying, "Oh, it's cold. There's some snow outside, so I guess where's the warming? Boo!" And that is absolutely stupid and shows that you have no understanding of what climate science and climate change is. So we really need to get serious about this because it is not a joke. The ice caps are melting, and there are going to be many places that are uninhabitable. And we want to argue about, we think that mass migration and things like this are a problem right now because of policies that people put in place. This policy is going to cause potentially world-ending migration before world-ending heat and the fact that everything is going to be underwater. It's not a joke. It's not a debatable fact. The climate is changing, and if you are opposed to the EPA regulations, if you're opposed to regulations that protect the environment, you are aiding and abetting the destruction of our planet. We earlier discussed, Ari and I, on part of episode 2 about the Fermi paradox, and this is part of that. The Fermi paradox basically argues that we have never seen alien life forms on this planet because by the time you develop technology that can get you off of your planet and onto another sustainable planet, you destroy yourselves. And that's either through nuclear war, generally, or some sort of arms race, or it is because of some sort of climate change or something like that. And we are rapidly approaching that. It cannot be argued anymore that we are not destroying our planet. We're murdering numerous animals. We're destroying ecosystems through both, if you look at the oceans, overfishing, and also, in addition to that, the amount of garbage and plastic that we throw into the ocean. It is destroying our planet, and if we don't get serious about it yesterday, we are in a lot of trouble. So I would encourage people to, again, push your representatives to push for everything you can to combat climate change. A lot of nations, like the one I live in right now, Taiwan, are pushing, people laugh at things like plastic straw bans and things like that. And I get that that's maybe a little too little too late, but it's something. And Taiwan is doing things like ending the use of recyclable plastics in the next decade. And that is going to make a big difference. You can scoff and laugh at that all you want, but it's going to make a big difference. And getting rid of fueled vehicles, like a lot of countries in Europe, by 2040, 2050 is going to make a big difference. So we have to push for these things. Otherwise, we will not have a planet to live on, because it will be so hot and there will be inclement weather at all times. So if you want to fight against these super storms and things that we are seeing and the mass climate change that we are facing right now, we have to get serious about this. It's no longer a debatable issue. It's no longer a laughing matter. It is something that we have to get on right now. So continuing on, another issue that I think he is on the wrong side of, being Kavanaugh, is that he is opposed to net neutrality. So I would assume that most people listening to this understand what net neutrality is. But for those that don't, net neutrality essentially guarantees that the internet remains the same as it has always been. It is a fair and open market. Everyone has equal access, whether you're a small, essentially a blog and podcast site that we have, or if you are the biggest, richest company in America, that your speeds are the same. ISPs, internet service providers, cannot slow down your connection based on whether they agree with you politically, or whether you give them enough money. And so they say, okay, we're going to give you a good speed. Or whether your customers pay for a package that gives you equal access to all parts of the internet. Basically, we've already, in the US, you've already seen the end of net neutrality. If that doesn't get curtailed and you don't start pushing for public broadband that gives equal access, there's going to be a lot of problems. There's going to be decreased access to broad views that disagree with your own. And I think that's super important. Whether you're on the left or the right, you need to get, everyone should have equal access. Even someone who I completely disagree with, for instance, like an Alex Jones type figure, who I think is either a crazy person or an actor. And there's almost nothing that I could get on board and agree with him. But I don't think that he should have his website slowed down just because the ISPs don't agree with his political philosophy. Because there's probably a lot of internet service providers that are rich companies that don't agree with me, because I would argue that we should have public high-speed internet that is paid for by taxes. And so they would try to shut our voice down and might be actively working to do so. Though I'm not going to get too big for our britches and think that they know who the hell I am right now, because almost certainly 15 people in the United States have heard of our website. That being said, it's a very important issue. Net neutrality is not a joke, and it will almost certainly affect a lot of aspects of your life. Whether that's just convenience of sites that you like, how fast they load, or if it's the access to quality information that you have. Because the big companies have an incentive to push for increasing the speeds of themselves and companies that they agree with, and slowing down speeds of companies and individuals that they disagree with. So we need to make sure that the internet remains open, free, and accessible to all. So we really have to get away from this. So if you want to look at instances of where he is on the wrong side of history when it comes to net neutrality, Kavanaugh in 2015, when the FCC reclassified internet services as Title II of the... So Title II is part of the Communications Act of 1934. And essentially what that says is that it has to be made affordable and available to all. It basically argues that that this service must be regulated like a public utility, just like you have phone companies. So you can still have a private company, but you have to regulate it as if it was a service for everyone. Okay, so you have to make it available and affordable to as many people as possible, and at the highest speed possible, which for anyone that lives in some sort of a rural area, you will know that that has already been somewhat farcical for a long time. You probably have at best 2 possible picks for who you want to be your ISP, and it is probably expensive. And if you want to pay for a decent speed that is comparable to a person that has choices, is laughable and very expensive. So, for instance, I've lived in the US and I had 2 choices, but one of them was essentially dial-up, and the other one was a 30 megabit download that we paid close to $100 a month for. And 30 megabit is not fast. It's okay if you're one single person, but in the current system, it's not great. But they basically had a monopoly on the market, and so they could charge essentially whatever they wanted. And in addition to that, they would also throttle our speeds quite often. So there would be times of day where we would either totally lose internet service or that they would throttle us, so our speed would go down quite significantly. So in opposition to that, when I moved to Taiwan, right now I believe we have 70 meg down, and we pay around $30 a month, something like that. And I don't really see us getting throttled, at least not nearly to the point that I noticed in the US. It is much more reasonable, and it seems to be quite all right. To continue to give you a little bit of an explanation to the idea of Title II, in terms of the Communication Act of 1934. So you have to give people the best possible speed and try to get it to everyone everyone that you can. And also, this was originally created for basically wire things, like for basically telephone and radio. And Kavanaugh argues that he was voting with precedent in his dissenting opinion, even though actually, like I mentioned before, it seems that he's voting against precedent because he is going against the Chevron doctrine. So I'll give you a more elaborate explanation of the Chevron doctrine. Basically, Chevron doctrine comes from Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, and they said that essentially this means that an agency can bring its own interpretation of a ambiguous rule as long as the court declares that their ruling is rational and reasonable. So the doctrine's scope has been sharpened over time as we move, but basically it still remains and shows that these individual agencies may kind of interpret the laws as they see fit. They're not allowed to, the court can't just say that they disagree with how they ruled. They're allowed to basically establish how they think that these things should be interpreted. So this kind of shows that not only is he probably in some ways against net neutrality, but in addition, he also may not be as apolitical and as into precedent as he likes to claim. To basically touch on a little bit more of the Chevron doctrine, because it's a very complicated issue. The basic idea is that these agencies have the ability to regulate themselves as they see fit. So as long as that the thing that they're regulating is convincingly vague enough for them to have that power. It seems that people like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, who was recently added to the Supreme Court, have such a problem with this is because it basically takes away some of their power. And obviously this can be argued either way to some degree, because if they're a bunch of liberal justices, you might be in favor of the way they rule,
because they are allowed to, maybe they have something that you view as a little bit better of a ruling. It's better for the U.S. people. And when it's the opposite, when there are conservative judges, and the agency is a little bit more liberal, or more, however you want to flip this, when the agency is more in favor of what you're in favor of, and the justice rule against that seems somewhat undemocratic, or at least it pulls away from your opinion, and it seems unfair for them to just carte blanche vote that this is not allowed. So the way I would think about this is that when you allow an agency who is generally backed by elected representatives as opposed to Supreme Court justices, this is better, because even if you have, like for instance, the EPA right now is being gutted internally, both from inside, from people that the Trump administration has put in place, but also from outside, where Trump has been pushing executive orders and things like that to deregulate things on like fossil fuels. And recently they came out and were arguing that basically solar radiation and radiation is not so bad for people, and maybe even a little bit is good for people, even though there's no science to back that up. At least those people you can replace every few years, whereas a Supreme Court justice, who are supposed to be apolitical but never have been and never will be, are on that court for, who knows, Kavanaugh could be on there for 40 years or more. So you have people like that have their own political ideologies and are in no way held accountable by voters. So the idea behind the Chevron doctrine is that the agencies should be able to regulate themselves, and I feel like that is more democratic than to say that these agencies have no agency and cannot control themselves, and that the Supreme Court can step in whenever it feels like they don't agree and overturn that. So I think that is going to be a big problem, especially when you look at the fact that the last two appointees are against the Chevron doctrine and probably will do whatever Daddy Trump tells them to do or is in favor of, because they are of the same ilk. So we'll see how that plays out, but the Chevron doctrine seems to be quite important. But again, the Chevron doctrine is a very, very complicated issue. I encourage you to try to do some research on your own. I did a lot of research trying to ascertain the exact principle of that law and to understand how it applies to current day and how it has shifted over time. Again, if you want to have a conversation with me or with Ari, comment and let us know what you think. If you disagree with anything that I've said here or have questions or anything like that, please comment, let us know. I will definitely get back to you. Especially since we have started doing the podcast, I've spent an arguably unhealthy amount of time monitoring the website, posting, editing podcasts, putting up podcasts, creating social media accounts, doing things like this to try to open up these sorts of conversations. So I pray that you listen to these things, you listen critically, and whether you agree or not, you engage, and we can have some sort of rational discourse. Even though right now I am very upset, so I am probably ranting a little bit much, but that is, just the facts on the ground, because I feel that we are going down the wrong path in the U.S. right now, and this is just one example of how we're doing that with the nomination and confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. So continuing on, the next part that I want to talk about that Kavanaugh has discussed is church and state. So in regards to church and state, Kavanaugh has said, or at least suggested, that he may be opening to widening the flow of public funding to religious institutions, religious schools. He praised Rehnquist in his efforts to reduce attempts at a stricter wall. So Rehnquist was trying to fight against stricter borders between church and state, especially when it comes to schools. So that just shows that seems like he may be in the same vein as Rehnquist when it comes to the funding and the lines between the United States government and religious schools. So whether you are a religious person or not, it seems that it would behoove you to be against the merging of church and state. Because, one, if you call yourself an originalist when it comes to the Constitution and you believe the Constitution should be upheld, then you should think that there should be some separation of church and state. I can give you a few examples. So in Article 6 of the Constitution, it states that the Constitution and the United States government should provide no religious test as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So also the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So basically what we want to do is make, obviously, America more free. You have people that argue that we should marry church and state further, but they will only argue that under the guise of fundamentalist Christian religion. And we can have a debate about how accurate that is in terms of the actual Bible. And I think that they would lose that argument because the Bible doesn't even support that. But you can also argue that in case of you talk to those people and you say, okay, so you think that we should be able to infuse religion farther with the state. And maybe they would say yes. And then you say, okay, so you're in favor of Christian Sharia. Or what if a Muslim person becomes president, not a fake Muslim like you would argue like Barack Obama, who is actually a Christian, or maybe you could argue an atheist, but certainly not a Muslim. So you argue that a Muslim becomes president and starts to imbibe America with Sharia law, then that would also be acceptable. Because if you're arguing that church and state can be combined, then that means that any sort of religion, so you could have someone who is a Hindu or someone who is a Taoist come in and begin to indoctrinate the U.S. with that, or begin to say, okay, so now we need to give school vouchers for Taoist schools because I think that that is the best religion, or Buddhist schools because I think that that is the best way forward and it would be best for the United States. So these arguments quickly fall apart when you take it away from the Christian majority of America, because the majority of people in America still do define themselves as Christians, but of course the definition of that is quite in the ether. It's very difficult to pin down what does that mean. When you ask someone, what does it mean to be a Christian, the definitions you get are almost always different. So if you ask some people, they would say they are, they probably wouldn't call themselves fundamentalists, but they are very fundamentalist, and they follow the Bible to a very strict definition, maybe even if they don't actually know how to translate that, because obviously the Bible in English is a little bit different from if you read it in the Greek and Aramaic and the original languages that it was written in. Furthermore, everyone, even in the English, has different interpretations. You have people that are, again, very fundamentalist, try to take as literal meaning as they can from it, as much as you can do that, because there are examples of contradiction in the Bible. And then you have people that are much more, maybe what you would call mystical in their Christianity, who I think a lot of those people would probably would not as much try to marry government and religion as much, because they would view it as a spiritual thing, where they're getting their own spiritual things out of the Christianity, and that the government is a separate thing, which I would say is more in line with what the founders would tell you that they thought. So if a lot of, especially conservatives, would probably argue more that they are either originalist or they really respect the founding fathers. So I can give you some quotes from the founding fathers. So Jefferson wrote in a newspaper from Massachusetts, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act that the whole American people, which declared their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state," which is where you get the term separation of church and state, was from Jefferson. So you can understand that. And there is another quote from Roger Williams in 1644 that says, "A hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world." So he is a Puritan minister and theologian and author who was from Rhode Island. He founded the colony of Rhode Island and was basically a staunch advocate for religious freedom and also for the separation of church and state. So Thomas Jefferson, in a sense, was echoing his sentiments. That is important for separation of church and state. And I feel like the people at the founding understood that much more than people now, because people want to argue that we are a Christian nation, and to some degree their sentiment is correct, because the United States is a majority Christian nation. But I feel like the people that came here around the founding of the United States understood much more that is much more based on time and place than these people think. It is not infinite that this will always be a quote-unquote Christian nation. It will not always be majority Christian, and that's what a lot of these, you see these T-evangelicals, these evangelical preachers on TV, and they're bemoaning the fact that we're becoming more of a secular society. Even though, again, as we go back, the government was founded to be a secular government. And I think that is for the best, because as things wax and wane, you have a potential to flip to maybe a more radical Christian government, or to a radical Islamic government, or any sort of those such things. And so if we keep religion out of the politics, we remove it from that, and religion is relegated to yourself, and you can help that shape yourself, and it can even shape your political identity, but it cannot shape the government. Because if politics starts to shape the government, we look more and more like a Saudi Arabia. We look more and more like a theocracy as opposed to a democracy. And I think that we should move more and more towards democracy and inclusion in this country, whether you have some sort of religious beliefs or not, and if you do have religious beliefs, whatever those are, as long as they're not hurting anyone else and you feel like they're benefiting you personally, I think that should be totally allowed, and that no one should be able to call that into question. That should not affect you or your job or how you are viewed. That's your personal choice, and it's what you think is best. And so if you want to have a discussion about that, that's fine, but that should not bar you from any sort of public office, and it should not in any way affect what sort of office that you can hold, or the way you vote, or if you're allowed to vote, or policy, or anything like that. So I think the separation of church and state is needed quite deeply in America. And I think because of the privileged position that a lot of fundamentalist Christians have in this society, that they don't quite understand that yet. But if they were to think about this critically, then they would start to understand that in any other situation, they would be calling for a separation of church and state. But because they don't, they want to ask everyone to say Merry Christmas. And they want to say that we are a Christian nation, even though a lot of the founders were not, in fact, Christians. Maybe they were deists, or deep down they were atheists, but that wasn't quite a thing during that time. It was very difficult to call yourself an atheist. Almost everyone believed in at least some sort of even like a deistic God that was not touching any sort of the world, just kind of a creator God that created and then stepped back. So, yeah, for instance, you have Republican heroes like Thomas Jefferson, or American heroes like Benjamin Franklin, who were both deists, who you can go back to Thomas Jefferson calling for closer ties with Muslim nations. because he viewed that as in the best interest of America, as opposed to viewing it as a Christian in the modern world, where we view it as a fight between the two. He did not view it as such. He viewed it more through the lens of the beneficiality of those two things merging. So, continuing on with this, referring to Kavanaugh, so Kavanaugh in a CNN interview in 2000 predicted that the court would uphold school vouchers in the future. So school vouchers are basically funding for whichever school the parents choose. So this gets back to the idea that we would give government funding for religious schools. But again, not to belabor the point, but if you give those sorts of things and you want to keep it even, which is the way it should be, America should strive to be a meritocracy and be open and even to all. If you want to do that, then you need to ask your Republican buddies, would it be okay if those school vouchers went to mosques, schools, Islamic schools for children? Is that okay? And if that's not okay, then it's also not okay for fundamentalist religious schools in America. So I'm okay if you want to keep having private schools, but they need to be private, they need to not be public, and they need to have zero public dollars going to them. Same thing with homeschooling. If you want to go do homeschooling, then you need to get the correct credentials to teach your kids, and you need to do it on your own dime. That is not for the United States taxpayer to pay for. I'm not going to pay for your kid to go to a school in which maybe it's a good school or maybe they're getting brainwashed. I don't know. I don't have any control over that because it's not public. It is private. So again, I won't belabor that point anymore, but I think it's a little bit hypocritical for a lot of these people to argue, okay, well, the taxpayers should pay for our private school, but if you come at them with even the simplest argument of, well, okay, on the other hand, should we at the same time pay for Islamic schools or give schools that are in mosques public funding with the same vouchers, I could almost guarantee you that their answer would be an emphatic no. So I think we just need to keep public funds and churches and private schools separate. And I think that will be better for America in the end. All right, so not to belabor the church and state thing, moving on to immigration, it seems that Kavanaugh is anti-immigration. While I am one who is for moderately strong borders, I think when you have people coming to this country seeking refugee status, you have to recognize that. You have to give these people a chance to join in on America's wealth and the fact that we are a huge nation with a great opportunity for a lot of people, especially people that in a lot of these countries that have been dejected, and a lot of their suffering is directly or indirectly tied to American policies. I won't belabor the point because I'll probably have a discussion with Ari when he comes back about this topic. In terms of Kavanaugh, he has opposed special visas for Brazilians because he said American workers can do the same job. He also voted to void a union election, which unions in America have basically been gutted. And it's proven that when you have strong unions, workers have better wages and there's better worker representation. So unions seem to be a good thing for America, even though there are problems with unions that I think should be dealt with. It seems that we need stronger unions in the states. But he voted to void union elections because he said that undocumented immigrants had voted and tainted the vote. I would argue that the vote of undocumented immigrants is probably a moot point. And again, when you have unions and strong unions, American workers do better. You have more representation, and thus you have better benefits and stronger wages. And you don't have people that are relegated to working for the poverty wage that is currently the minimum wage in the U.S., which basically just subjects average Americans to working perhaps 2 or more jobs and also living on some sort of government assistance. So you make these corporations that are making millions or billions of dollars pay their citizens a living wage, and thus you relieve the burden from the taxpayer, and these CEOs and owners of the company may make slightly less money. Boo fucking who for you, but you are still insanely rich, and you make these people not have to rely on the government for assistance. So, one example of this would be the things that Bernie Sanders has recently come out with. One of them being the Stop Bezos Act, which basically stops Amazon from, and other corporations, but Amazon by name, from being corporate welfare queens and relying on the U.S. to pick up the slack where they don't pay their workers enough money. Most of you probably know that Jeff Bezos is the richest man on the planet. He is worth over $100 billion, billion with a B, which is we've had discussions about this, Ari and I, but and I will let him come back so we can actually have another discussion on this. But I think that is almost an illegal amount of money to have, because you can essentially, especially in a system like America, buy the government when you have hundreds of billions of dollars and you are not held accountable. Also, I would like to point out that last year Amazon paid, I'll let you guys guess real quick if you want to throw out a number that you think the amount of money that they paid for the owner Bezos, that has over 100, again, billion with a B, dollars. That's right, they paid $0 in federal taxes. And they pay their workers a minimum wage in a lot of cases. Some of their workers protested this and said that they have to pee in bottles or wear diapers during their shifts because they are not allowed access to bathrooms adequately. So I think the problem is obvious, and I will not, again, belabor this point, but we will visit this again in a future podcast. So Bernie introduced this Stop Bezos Act, which basically said that any Amazon workers that work there, I believe full-time, if they received any benefits from the federal government, that the company would in turn have to pay those wages back, because they are essentially being welfare queens, which is something that Republicans often accuse poor Americans of, but in fact is more often persecuted by the very rich in America who don't want to pay their fair share in wages or taxes. So recently Bezos announced that they will raise the minimum wage for full-time workers, which is good, and that is why we need to push for such legislation more and more. And in addition to that, because we have pushed, or Bernie Sanders has pushed Bezos into that position, it is likely that he will push his competitors to do the same, because it is a business-savvy move, being that he now has to pay his workers more, and he will continue to profit. It is not going to bankrupt him. If you want to argue that, you are a silly person, and I don't have time for you. So we need to keep doing things like that. To continue a little bit tangentially before I get back on topic, Bernie has also recently pushed for the Too Big to Fail, Too Big to Exist Act, or the bill, which basically would propose to break up the big banks that caused the crash in 2008. The idea is basically if you own, and again, we'll do a little bit more in-depth coverage of this later. I may in fact write an article about this bill because it's amazing. Basically, if you make a certain amount, or you hold a certain amount, I believe it's over between 2 to 5% of the GDP, then you are not allowed to exist as a bank, because that is potentially detrimental to America, especially if you do not handle that well. So this would break up a lot of large financial banks and other institutions, such as insurance companies, and it would force them to be somewhat smaller and thus protect the financial interests of America in a better sense. Again, I'll come back to this in another podcast because we are pushing like almost 3 hours here, and I'm going to keep talking for a lot longer because I am a motor mouth, and I apologize, but I have so much to discuss right now. So continuing on with Kavanaugh, in the fact that he would be bad for people, we just got done talking about immigration, and immigrants are people, despite what some people on the right might tell you. So continuing on, we'll talk about workers. So he said that workers, Kavanaugh, must waive the right to picket during arbitration agreements. So this is in line with the whole unionization thing. Like I said, when you have better, stronger unions, you have better, stronger wages, and it is better for workers in general. Again, you can argue that there are problems, but I would say that giving people a good, strong union that can defend them, and then dealing with the problems that come from that is much better than dealing with people working 2 to 3 jobs and still living in abject poverty and taking money from the government, as opposed to the large corporations that employ them. So I've probably belabored that point enough. Again, if you would like to discuss that with me, I would love to have that discussion with you at any time. So continuing on, he is the next topic that we'll discuss is privacy. So in terms of privacy, he voted for the NSA spying powers being upheld, including the collection of metadata, calling it consistent with the Fourth Amendment, and argues that national security outweighs the impact on privacy. What I would like to say to him is, fuck you. Have you seen what China is doing? Ari and I discussed this in, I believe, our most recent episode. There is a network that in China that monitors people and gives you a social rating. So what that says is that, depending on what you buy, depending on what kind of social media posts you put out there, that they get to give you a score, and that could result in things as simple as how people view you, and it could result in things as big as, do you get to travel? And in China, this is not confirmed, but maybe you get put in some sort of detention center or re-education camp, like the Uyghurs that we discussed in episode 2 and a little bit in episode 3. So, NSA spying powers are completely fly in the face of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment argues for the right of American people against unlawful search and seizure, and seizing someone's metadata without a warrant is completely against the Fourth Amendment. So to try to argue that is a Sisyphean task. I think that you are trying to do something that is impossible, and to do such just shows your true colors as a just a corporatist and a person that a lot of Republicans argue that they're scared of some sort of deep state. The NSA is the deep state. They want to collect all of your data, and they want to, whenever they feel like it, use it against you. And if you are opposed to government, then they will and can use that against you to show that you are unpatriotic or whatever that they want to say. So no, that is not okay. Collecting Americans' metadata is not acceptable. That is a violation of your civil rights, and you should fight that tooth and nail. In addition, he said that a suspect had no reasonable expectation to privacy in his public movements after a GPS tracker was placed on his car by authorities. He later did argue that there was some potential argument for the fact that they were not allowed to tamper with his car because it was a personal asset. However, it seems that he doesn't really care about the fact that the government might spy on you or might try to collect your data, and that is very worrying. I think that that is not acceptable and should not be the position of a judge. That should be in favor of, one, being a constitutionalist, being in favor of the Constitution, and also it is very against basic freedoms and civil liberties. So I will continue as to not rant. The next thing that we come to is the big one that especially a lot of people in social media are talking about, which is abortion and birth control. Kavanaugh said that Obamacare infringed on the right of religious organizations because of the mandate for contraception. I would say that this is a big whistle that a lot of conservatives put out there. They say, you are hurting our basically our right to make sure that women get pregnant and that they don't get to control their own bodies. And also for all those that want to make the big argument about they are pro-life, even though that is farcical, because a lot of people that argue that they are anti-abortion, which is really what they should call themselves, is anti-abortionist, perhaps pro-fetus, not actually pro-life. They would also argue that children should be locked in cages when they come across the border without documentation when they are searching for refugee status. They would also not give half of a fuck when people are drone striked in the Middle East. Recently, that I mentioned earlier, we sold some bombs to Saudi Arabia, and they bombed a school. They bombed a school bus, and upwards of 40 kids were killed. I haven't heard any Republican outrage about that. We've bombed, personally, as the U.S., schools for the blind. We've bombed weddings, things like this. The body count is pretty high on the part of the U.S., especially in terms of innocent civilians. So if you would like to call yourself pro-life, I would like to hear that you call against these things as well, not just bitch and moan when someone has an abortion, especially because most of those happen while the, if you want to call it, quote-unquote, child is still a zygote, basically a clump of cells. If you really have strong feelings about that, I suggest that you make contraception more available. You also do some actual sexual education in America as opposed to abstinence only, which basically teaches kids that sex is bad, and if you have sex before you're married, you'll die. And if you teach people like that, it's the exact same as abstinence only in the sense of drugs, instead of safe use. And so when they find out that sex is fun and it feels good and that you're full of shit, that they will continue to do so, and they will have no actual education. So, yeah, my main point is stop calling yourself pro-life if you're pro-zygote. Only call yourself pro-life if you are in favor of all life. Whether that's a brown kid coming from south of the border in the U.S., or whether that's a brown kid overseas in the Middle East, or whether that's a black kid in the middle of Chicago that gets gunned down by a police officer because he has a toy gun, anything like that, or a black teenager in St. Louis that you want to call an adult, even though you call Kavanaugh a teenager and you say, oh, well, he was a teenager, he was just a boy. You want to call these people boys, but when it comes to Tamir Rice and all these other people that are people of color and they get gunned down by police, you say, well, they had it coming, they were threatening, I'm so scared of black people. We get it, but please stop calling yourself pro-life because it is infuriating. Continuing on with the abortion and birth control thing, he also dissented in a case where an undocumented immigrant was getting an abortion. This one is a little bit more of an arguable case. I don't know the exact details of the case, so I'm going to let that one lie for a bit. I'll probably have more discussion later with Ari over this and probably all these cases. So I know that was long. This podcast is long, and I am not quite done. And I either will say I'm sorry, or if you're happy about this, I say no problem. I love recording long podcasts. I don't like listening to myself talk, so editing this thing is going to be a nightmare. But I do like ranting and talking. It's a little bit better when I have someone to talk with. But obviously I have no trouble talking for damn near 3 hours. So anyway, getting towards the conclusion of this, the next question to all of this, now that we have a lot of this information, is what do we do? What can be done? Is there anything that we can do to stop, slow down, mitigate any of these types of things that are going to come about because of the wanton disregard for justice by these Republican senators? And by the Republican senators, I also include Joe Manchin. All right, so discussing where we go from here. As I talked about earlier, the process for impeachment is incredibly difficult. But here are basically the potentials for what could happen. So again, it's going to be very difficult for the Dems, if not impossible, to even take a simple majority in the Senate. Even if they do, it will be basically impossible for them to get a supermajority, barring some sort of wild evidence in the Blasey Ford or other cases against Kavanaugh. However, if the Dems take the House in 2018, they will hold the subpoena power. So if they do take the House, almost certainly Gerald Nadler will take the chair as the House on the House Judiciary Committee, and he has committed, at least on the Intercepted podcast with Jeremy Scahill, to investigating any credible allegations of perjury. So that could be one path in which we get some trial on perjury. There are a few other options where Kavanaugh could be tried for perjury, but again, this is pretty unlikely. Really, the only other option we have for fixing the Supreme Court would be some sort of court packing plan. For people that don't totally understand this, basically, it's happened before. So court packing essentially is the idea that because the Constitution doesn't define the Supreme Court as a set number of judges, that a president could add or remove judges. So if we look at legislation on this, in 1869, there's a Judiciary Act that stated that Congress had established the United States Supreme Court would consist of one chief justice and 8 associate judges. So the big part where this was first dealt a big blow against this idea was, of course, as most people know, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, when he was trying to pass his New Deal legislation, which, in my opinion, was great for America, created tons of jobs, and basically expanded our infrastructure infinitely. And in my opinion, we should create a New Deal, and we should push for more of this. We should take our infrastructure from a grade of D plus, and we should change it into a modern infrastructure. We should create trains, high-speed rails, and we should create hundreds of jobs, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs while we do it. But anyway, so he got a bill called the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill of 1937. A lot of people refer to this as the court packing plan. And basically this bill said that he could add more U.S. Supreme Court justices, again, because there was never any set number of judges set forth in the Constitution. There was a lot of argument about this, but eventually it was passed, and he was allowed to add more judges. This is basically because of his popularity at the time. He won a ridiculously popular election, namely in 1936, and for most people that know, he was so popular basically that they created term limits to stop him because he was just killing it. And so this is a potential option for a future Democratic president if a Democratic president wins in the next election. When I say if, that probably gives a lot of people pause because they think there's no way that a Republican could win after all the things that Trump has done. And there's probably a lot of people that think Trump won't serve his full term. What I would caution people against is a little bit of this sort of thinking that it's impossible for Trump to serve his full term and it's impossible for him to win re-election, or for that matter, for some other Republican to win re-election. While I do think it's absurd that Trump is president and he has very low approval ratings, I would caution people that it really depends who the Democrats run. I've had this discussion with Ari before, and I feel like we are in mostly agreement. He is probably a little bit more optimistic than me, and again, I'm not trying to mischaracterize his thoughts and opinions, and so again, we will have a better discussion on this in the future. But if the Republicans run Trump again, or if he wins the nomination again, or someone similar to him wins the nomination, and Democrats decide to run another corporatist like Hillary Clinton, it is immensely possible that they will lose again. We could see 4 more years of Trump. We could see 8 more years of a Republican politician. It is getting more likely that we will not, because a lot of people are getting registered to vote, and people are getting mobilized because they are appalled by the things that are happening in the current administration. But if people begin to become apathetic, or they believe that it is a long shot or impossible for him to get reelected, he will get reelected again, because that is precisely what happened the first time. Everyone I talked to, they said, and even for some of that myself, I said, no, there's no way that this reality star buffoon, he's a absolute maniac. He's a joke. He doesn't actually have any real thoughts or opinions. He might have dementia. He has something clearly wrong with him and cannot articulate any sort of actual idea except for that something is screwed up in the country. And I would argue that he's right about that. But he's exactly like every right-wing fraud in America, where he says, There's a problem in America. People are not making enough money. The people on the lower rungs of society are screwed over. And then they pivot to something else. Whether you have the alt-right, neo-Nazi people that would say, oh, it's because of immigration, which is obviously not the problem. It's not a poor person from Bolivia that is fucking you over. It is your elected representatives. Using representatives loosely, those are the people that are stealing from your plate. Those are the people that are putting you more deeply into poverty. They are the people that are keeping reasonable, reliable, cheaper healthcare from you. And those are the people that you should be angry with, ashamed with, and that you should vote out of office. But if we don't address that, if the Democrats don't assess and effectively message the problem that we are seeing in America, it is absolutely possible that we will see a repeat of the 2016 elections. We will see a corporatist Democrat against a fake populist on the Republican side. And because Trump has his own way of doing politics, and there is probably 20% of the country that will follow him no matter what, because they are sycophants and they don't listen to facts or reason or logic, that they will follow him into battle wherever he goes. And if the Democrats choose to run someone like Hillary, who is robotic and fake and can't articulate a real message and doesn't push for things that are overwhelmingly popular in the United States, they will lose. Hillary had to be pushed into opposing things that were overwhelmingly popular and oftentimes still would not go to that degree. So currently, you have over 70% of Americans are in favor of a Medicare for all system. That's over 50% of Republicans that are in favor of Medicare for all. So when you message that correctly and you explain to people what a Medicare for all system means and the fact that it is cheaper, and that anyone that tells you that it is not cheaper and is not a better system for the American people is a liar. And when they tell you that these fake facts that is more expensive, that they should be called a liar and they should be booed off stage, whether they are a political pundit or they are looking for election, that you should tell them to shut up and go home, and that you don't want to hear them and that you will not vote for them because they're a liar. In addition, there are things like marijuana legalization, overwhelmingly popular. Over 60% of people are in favor of marijuana legalization. If you run a populist campaign and you tell people these things are the things you want, they're popular, I see that, I see you, I see what you need, I see you're struggling, and I'm going to do my best to pass the things you want to pass. I'm going to grow unions, I'm going to increase the minimum wage, and you help the regular Americans, you will win. But I am scared that the Democrats have not learned their lesson from 2016, and instead they're going to try to appeal to identity politics, and they're going to run someone like Kamala Harris or someone of that ilk, and they are not going to be a true populist. They're not going to be a true progressive. And Trump will sniff that out, and the American people will sniff that out, and they will get destroyed. And we will have another 4 years of this monster or someone similar to him, maybe not Trump, but even if you get someone like Pence in there, he is the same or maybe worse, because Trump is a buffoon, but Pence is an evil, maniacal person, and he is at least smart enough to put a happy face on these things, and he's Trump minus mean tweets. Something that Kyle Kalinske says is a lot of these politicians are Trump without the mean tweets, and I think that is completely accurate. If you take a lot of these Republicans and you take away Donald Trump's unpolished nature, maybe you will lose, I think you will lose some of his base supporters because it's not as natural. They see a fake politician, but it's basically the same idea, and they can lie to these people the same way. And I think they might take a key from him and be a little bit more unreserved. They might not be as polished. They might realize people want a real person, not a fake actor. And if the Republicans notice that and realize and react to that before the Democrats do, and they don't give them a real person, it is extremely possible that the Democrats will lose again in 2020. And not to be overly dramatic, but that will be disastrous. We're already in so much trouble. Name a front on which we're in trouble, and I can tell you that it's a dumpster fire. We are absolutely bailing out water. On terms of foreign policy, most other nations think we're a joke. As I've said multiple times, our infrastructure gets a grade of D. Our infrastructure is terrible. People are suffering because of that. Wages are at all-time lows. They haven't increased because there's been no actual increase since the 1970s and 1980s. As inflation has increased, our wages have remained stagnant. As a result, you have people that are not able to afford homes, not able to grow themselves as people, not able to go to college. You have more and more homeless people in America. You have numerous legal wars that are draining our economy of money, and as a result are returning people back home that have various mental illnesses, including PTSD, and that's why you have 40,000 homeless veterans on the streets right now that the GOP does not give a shit about. And that's why those people are sitting there and no one's talking about it. No one's presenting an idea that or legislation that could help protect these people. That's unsurprising, though. I mean, you can look at my Medicare for All article to see that the GOP, most of them were in opposition to a bill that would have protected and given health care to first responders to 9/11, which they love to talk about. Remember 9/11, remember 9/11, Rudy Giuliani 9/11. He was there. He didn't do shit. He fucked everything up. But 9/11. So we need to get away from virtue signaling. You have to say, you can't just talk about these things. Tell me what your policy is. And if a person cannot tell you what their policy is and how it's going to benefit the Americans, and if it doesn't make sense, then you need to vote them out. You need to say that you're bullshitting us. We have no time for this, and we're tired of it. We're weak, we're weary of this shit. And we need to move on. We need to make our country stronger as opposed to just continuing on with the status quo. People are dying because of the policies that are going on in America, and we're making it worse. Kavanaugh is your Supreme Court Justice right now. We need to buck up, or it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And my hope is that instead of letting this destroy us, it makes us stronger, and we push and we fight against this, and we make America better. Maybe we make America great. Not again, but we make America greater.